Prepare yourself for a deep dive into one of the most macabre and disturbing cases in Chicago history. Before we begin, please write in the comments below where you are listening from and what time it is right now. In the winter of 1932, during the coldest month Chicago had seen in over a decade, a series of events began to unfold in a three-story brownstone on South Throop Street that would remain sealed in county archives for nearly 4 decades. The building stood between a shuttered textile factory and a boarding house that had been abandoned since the stock market collapsed 3 years prior. Most residents of the neighborhood avoided that particular block after dark, though few could articulate exactly why. The street lamps on that stretch had been broken for months, and the city had no funds to repair them. What happened inside that brownstone was not documented in any official police report until 1967, when a set of private letters was donated to the Cook County Historical Society by the estate of a deceased postal worker. Those letters, written in careful script on yellowed paper, contained descriptions that contradicted every public account of what became known locally as the Throop Street incident. The brownstone had been purchased in the autumn of 1931 by a man named Emmett Crowder, who listed his occupation on city records as a spiritual counselor. Crowder was 43 years old, thin to the point of gauntness, with deep-set eyes that neighbors later described as unnervingly still. He arrived in Chicago from somewhere in rural Indiana, though the exact town was never verified. With him came his wife, Ida, a woman of 38, who spoke so infrequently that some assumed she was mute. They moved into the brownstone with minimal furniture and no visitors for the first 2 months. A grocer, who delivered supplies to the building once a week, noted that Ida always answered the door, never Emmett, and that she paid in exact change without ever making eye contact. The grocer remembered that she always wore long sleeves, even during an unexpected warm spell in November. He remembered because the heat inside the building was stifling, yet she never removed her coat. By December of 1931, small gatherings began to occur at the brownstone. They happened on Thursday evenings, always after 9 o'clock. Attendees arrived alone or in pairs, entering quickly through the side door that faced an empty lot. A woman named Loretta Finch, who lived in the boarding house across the street before it closed, kept a diary that was later recovered by her niece. In an entry dated December 10, 1931, Loretta wrote that she counted 11 people entering the brownstone that night. She noted that none of them spoke to each other outside and that they all wore dark clothing. She also noted something else. Every person who entered carried a small cloth bundle under their arm, roughly the size of a loaf of bread. Loretta could not see what was inside the bundles, but she observed that each person gripped theirs tightly as though afraid it might slip. She wrote that the last person to arrive that night was a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, who paused at the door and looked back over her shoulder before going inside. Loretta described the expression on the young woman's face as one of someone about to step into cold water. The gatherings continued through the winter, increasing in frequency. By January of 1932, they were occurring 3 times a week. Neighbors began to notice other details. The brownstone's windows were covered with heavy black fabric that blocked all interior light. No sound ever escaped the building during the gatherings, not even the murmur of conversation. This silence was noted by multiple residents as deeply unnatural, given the number of people who entered. A mailman named Horace DeWitt, who delivered to the block every morning, later testified in a private inquiry that he once pressed his ear to the door of the brownstone out of curiosity. He heard nothing, not voices, not footsteps, nothing. He said the silence was so complete that it felt as though the building itself was holding its breath. Horace also noted that he never saw anyone leave the brownstone in the mornings, though he passed by at the same time each day. Around 7 o'clock, He assumed there must have been a rear exit, but he never confirmed this. Among the regular attendees of the gatherings was a woman named Margaret Hollis, a widow of 31, who lived in a cramped apartment 6 blocks away. Margaret had lost her husband to tuberculosis in 1929 and her only child, a daughter, to scarlet fever the following year. She worked as a seamstress in a factory on the west side of the city and kept largely to herself. Her landlord, a man named Samuel Pratt, later provided a written statement to a private investigator that Margaret had become increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to her involvement with the brownstone. She stopped attending church, stopped speaking to other tenants, and began arriving home at odd hours, sometimes well past midnight. Samuel noted that Margaret's appearance changed as well. She lost weight rapidly, her skin took on a greyish pallor, and she developed a persistent cough that she refused to have examined. When Samuel asked if she was unwell, Margaret told him she was undergoing a treatment. She did not elaborate. What no one outside the brownstone knew at the time was that Emmett Crowder had begun promoting a specific doctrine among his followers. This doctrine, pieced together from letters and later testimonies, centered on the belief that physical suffering could purify the soul and open a conduit to a divine presence that Crowder referred to only as the waiting light. According to Crowder's teachings, this presence had been dormant for centuries, waiting for a group of devoted individuals willing to offer themselves as vessels. The process of becoming a vessel required what Crowder called a ritual of emptying. Followers were instructed to bring their own instruments to the gatherings. These instruments were never named explicitly in any surviving documents, but references to sharp objects and the need for sterilization appear repeatedly. Followers were told that the act of bleeding was not self-harm, but a sacred offering. Crowder assured them that the pain was temporary and necessary. He promised that those who committed fully would witness the arrival of the waiting light and be granted a miracle specific to their deepest need. For Margaret Hollis, this meant the return of her daughter. The gatherings themselves followed a rigid structure. Attendees arrived and descended to the basement of the brownstone, where Emmett had set up what he described as a sanctum. The basement was a low-ceilinged space with exposed brick walls and a dirt floor. Crowder had installed wooden benches in a circle around a central area that remained empty. Candles provided the only illumination. Ida Crowder was always present, but never participated in the rituals. She stood in a corner of the room, motionless, observing. Her role, according to one account, was to bear witness. The rituals began with Crowder speaking in a low, rhythmic tone. He did not shout or preach. He spoke as though confiding a secret. He reminded his followers that the world above had failed them, that their suffering had been ignored, that they had been abandoned by every institution that promised salvation. He told them that the waiting light would not abandon them. He told them it was listening. After Crowder finished speaking, the followers were instructed to begin the ritual of emptying. Each person used their own instrument to make shallow cuts on their forearms or wrists. The cuts were not deep enough to cause serious injury, but sufficient to produce a steady flow of blood. Followers were told to let the blood drip onto the dirt floor of the basement, into the central area. Crowder walked among them during this process, offering words of encouragement. He told them they were closer than ever. He told them the waiting light could feel their devotion. He told them the miracle was imminent. The sessions lasted between 2 and 3 hours. When they concluded, followers bandaged themselves and left the brownstone one at a time, spaced several minutes apart. They were instructed never to speak of what occurred in the basement, not even to each other outside of the gatherings. Violation of this rule, Crowder warned, would sever their connection to the waiting light permanently. Margaret Hollis attended the gatherings faithfully from January through March of 1932. In a letter she wrote to her sister in Ohio, but never mailed, found among her belongings after her disappearance, Margaret described the experience as the only thing that made her feel close to her daughter again. She wrote that during the rituals, she could feel a presence in the room, something vast and patient. She wrote that Emmett Crowder had promised her that if she remained devoted, her daughter would return to her, not in body but in spirit, as a vision that would grant her peace. Margaret believed him. She wrote that she had begun to see shadows moving in her peripheral vision at home, shapes that resembled a small child. She wrote that she knew these were signs that the waiting light was responding to her offerings. By the end of March 1932, the number of regular attendees at the brownstone had grown to 18. Among them was a man named Victor Lang, a former schoolteacher who had been dismissed from his position 2 years earlier under circumstances that were never made public. Victor was 51 years old, unmarried, and lived alone in a rented room above a butcher shop. He had been introduced to Crowder through a mutual acquaintance, a man named Harold Pine, who had since stopped attending the gatherings. Victor became one of Crowder's most devoted followers. In a journal recovered from his room after his death, Victor wrote extensively about the rituals. He described the sensation of the cutting as transcendent, a moment when the boundary between his body and something greater dissolved. He wrote that Crowder had told him the waiting light would grant him forgiveness for an unnamed sin that had haunted him for decades. Victor wrote that he felt the forgiveness beginning to take hold, that the weight he had carried for so long was lifting. He also wrote that Crowder had begun to ask more of his followers. The rituals were becoming more intense. The cuts were deeper. The sessions were longer. Victor wrote that some followers had begun to show signs of illness, persistent infections, fevers, but that Crowder assured them this was part of the process. The body had to weaken before the spirit could strengthen. In April of 1932, a woman named Estelle Cord, who had attended the gathering since February, collapsed during a ritual. Estelle was 29 years old, a former clerk at a department store that had closed the previous year. She lived with her elderly mother in a tenement on the near South Side. Estelle had been making cuts on her arms and legs for weeks, and the wounds had not healed properly. According to a letter written by another attendee, a man named Thomas Wick, Estelle lost consciousness and began convulsing on the basement floor. Crowder did not call for medical help. Instead, he knelt beside Estelle and placed his hands on her forehead. He told the other followers that Estelle was experiencing a breakthrough, that the waiting light was entering her. He instructed them to continue their own rituals and not to interfere. Estelle stopped convulsing after several minutes and lay still. Crowder said she was resting. After the session ended, Ida Crowder and another follower helped Estelle up the stairs and into a room on the second floor of the brownstone. Thomas Wick wrote that he never saw Estelle leave the building after that night. He wrote that when he asked Crowder about her, Crowder told him Estelle had been chosen for a deeper communion with the waiting light, and was no longer bound by the same rules as the rest of them. Thomas did not ask again. Margaret Hollis disappeared on the evening of April 23, 1932. She left her apartment at 8 o'clock, as she had done every Thursday for the past 3 months, and walked to the brownstone. Her landlord, Samuel Pratt, noted that she seemed more agitated than usual. She was muttering to herself as she descended the stairs, and she forgot to close the door to her apartment behind her. Samuel called out to her, but she did not respond. She did not return that night, or any night after. Samuel waited 2 days before reporting her absence to the police. The police took a statement, but conducted no investigation. Disappearances were common during those years, and Margaret had no family in the city to press for action. Samuel mentioned the brownstone on South Throop Street during his statement, but the officer who took the report did not follow up. The officer noted that Margaret was an adult and had left of her own volition. There was no evidence of foul play. The case was closed before it was ever opened. What happened to Margaret Hollis inside the brownstone that night was never officially documented, but fragments of information emerged years later. A man named Leonard Thorne, who had attended the gatherings intermittently, gave a verbal account to a priest in 1953, shortly before Leonard's death from cirrhosis. Leonard told the priest that on the night of April 23rd, Crowder announced that the time had come for the final offering. He said that the waiting light had grown strong enough to manifest, but it required one follower to serve as a permanent vessel. Crowder said the vessel would not die, but would be transformed, existing in a state between life and the presence of the waiting light. He said the vessel would be granted the ultimate miracle, the dissolution of all suffering. Leonard told the priest that Margaret Hollis volunteered immediately. She stood and walked to the center of the basement without hesitation. Crowder asked her to lie down on the dirt floor. She did. He asked the other followers to surround her in a circle and continue their own rituals while he performed the final rite. Leonard said he did not watch what Crowder did next. He kept his eyes on the floor and focused on the pain in his own arms. He said he heard Margaret's breathing become rapid and then slow. He said he heard Crowder speaking in a language he did not recognize. He said the candles in the basement flickered and went out, and they were in complete darkness for what felt like several minutes. When the candles were relit, Margaret was gone. Crowder said she had been taken by the waiting light and that her transformation was complete. He said they should rejoice. Leonard told the priest that he did not feel joy. He felt a coldness that stayed with him for the rest of his life. The gatherings at the brownstone continued for another month after Margaret's disappearance. In late May of 1932, Victor Lang stopped attending. In his journal, he wrote that he had begun to doubt Crowder's promises. He wrote that the miracle he had been waiting for had not arrived, and that his body was deteriorating. The infections on his arms had spread, and he could no longer grip a pen without pain. He wrote that he had seen Ida Crowder alone in the hallway of the brownstone one evening, and that she had looked at him with an expression he could not decipher. He wrote that her eyes were red, as though she had been crying for hours, but she made no sound. Victor left the brownstone that night and never returned. He died in a charity hospital in 1934. His journal was found among his possessions and later donated to a university archive by a social worker. On June 11, 1932, the brownstone on South Throop Street was found empty. A city inspector conducting routine checks for building code violations entered through the unlocked front door and discovered that all the furniture had been removed. The walls were bare, and the floors had been scrubbed clean. The inspector noted that the basement door was nailed shut. He did not attempt to open it. The inspector filed a report indicating that the property appeared abandoned and recommended that it be seized by the city for unpaid taxes. The property was auctioned in 1933 and purchased by a real estate speculator who never developed it. The building remained vacant for decades. In 1951, a group of children playing in the empty lot next to the brownstone reported seeing a woman standing in one of the second-floor windows. The children described her as thin and pale, wearing a long dark dress. When adults investigated, they found no one inside the building. The children insisted they had seen her clearly. One child said the woman had been crying. In 1967, when the letters and journals related to the brownstone were finally compiled, a retired police detective named Arthur Boyle took an interest in the case. Arthur had been a young officer in 1932, but had not been involved in any investigations related to South Throop Street. He requested access to the county archives and spent several months reviewing the documents. Arthur discovered that Emmett Crowder had no verifiable history before arriving in Chicago. The name appeared on the property deed and a few business transactions, but there were no birth records, no employment records, no previous addresses. Arthur also discovered that Ida Crowder's maiden name was Ida Marsh, and that she had been reported missing in 1927 from a town in Indiana called Ellsworth. Her family had filed a report, but she was never found. Arthur attempted to locate any surviving followers of Crowder's group, but was only able to confirm that most had died by the late 1940s. Those who survived refused to speak about their involvement. Arthur wrote a summary of his findings and submitted it to the Cook County Historical Society, where it was filed and forgotten. The brownstone on South Throop Street was demolished in 1968 to make way for a public housing project. During the demolition, workers opened the basement door that had been nailed shut for over 3 decades. Inside, they found the remains of the wooden benches and a large stain on the dirt floor in the center of the room. The stain was dark and covered an area roughly 6 feet in diameter. Samples were taken, but the results were never made public. Workers also found something else. Carved into the brick wall at the far end of the basement were dozens of names, etched in uneven letters. Margaret Hollis was among them. So was Estelle Cord. So were the names of 16 other individuals whose identities were never confirmed. The workers covered the wall and completed the demolition without further examination. The site is now occupied by a building that houses low-income apartments. Residents have reported no unusual occurrences. In the winter of 1969, a package arrived at the Cook County Historical Society. It contained a single letter, unsigned and undated, written in a shaking hand. The letter described the final days of Emmett Crowder. The writer claimed to have been a follower who left the group before the end, but had maintained contact with one other member, a woman named Ruth Calloway. Ruth had told the writer that after the brownstone was abandoned, Crowder and Ida moved to a farmhouse in rural Illinois near a town called Belmont. Ruth said that Crowder had become increasingly erratic, claiming that the waiting light had rejected him, that he had failed to complete the work. Ruth said that Ida tried to care for him, but he refused food and water. He spent his days in a locked room, speaking to no one. In early September of 1932, Ruth visited the farmhouse and found Ida sitting on the front porch. Ida told Ruth that Emmett had died 3 days earlier. She said she had not called anyone because she did not know what to say. Ruth asked to see the body. Ida led her to the locked room. Emmett's body was lying on a bare mattress, covered with a sheet. Ruth said his arms were covered in scars, hundreds of them, layered over each other. Ida told Ruth that Emmett had continued the rituals alone, waiting for the waiting light to return. It never did. Ruth helped Ida bury Emmett in a field behind the farmhouse. They marked the grave with a wooden cross that had no name. Ruth left and never saw Ida again. The letter ended with a single line: "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. No official record exists of Emmett Crowder's death. No death certificate was filed. No obituary was published. The farmhouse near Belmont was identified through property records in the 1980s, but by then it had been destroyed by fire. The origin of the fire was never determined. Local residents had no memory of anyone named Crowder living in the area. The land where the farmhouse stood is now part of a larger agricultural tract, and no trace of the structure remains. The grave that Ruth Calloway described was never located. Whether it exists at all is unknown. What is known is that the names carved into the basement wall of the brownstone on South Throop Street represented individuals who vanished without explanation between January and June of 1932. None of them were ever found. Their families, if they had any, received no answers. The city of Chicago kept no record of their disappearances. The case was never investigated as a crime. In the decades that followed, a few researchers attempted to piece together what had occurred inside the brownstone, but the lack of official documentation made any definitive conclusion impossible. The letters and journals that survived offered only fragments, glimpses into a world that operated entirely in shadow. What emerges from those fragments is a portrait of desperation so profound that it overrode every instinct of self-preservation. The followers of Emmett Crowder were not coerced through violence. They were drawn by the promise of relief from suffering that the world had failed to address. They believed, or wanted to believe, that pain could be transmuted into meaning. They believed that their bodies, marked and opened, could become conduits for something greater than themselves. They believed Emmett Crowder when he told them the waiting light was real. And when the promised miracle did not arrive, when the suffering only deepened, they found themselves trapped in a cycle from which there was no easy escape. To leave meant admitting that everything they had endured was for nothing. To stay meant continuing down a path that had already claimed too much. For some, the choice was made for them. For others, the choice was never really a choice at all. The final known document related to the brownstone is a receipt dated October 3, 1932, from a hospital in southern Illinois. The receipt indicates that a woman was treated for severe blood loss and malnutrition. The woman gave her name as Ida Marsh. She was discharged after 2 days and left no forwarding address. The hospital staff noted that the woman refused to answer questions about her injuries and became agitated when pressed. She left the hospital against medical advice and was never seen again. Whether this was Ida Crowder is impossible to confirm, but the name, the timing, and the nature of the injuries align with what little is known about her final months. If it was her, then Ida Crowder disappeared into the same obscurity that claimed her husband and the followers who trusted him. She left no trace, no explanation, no testimony. Like so many others connected to the brownstone on South Throop Street, she simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. What remains is a story without resolution, a series of events that defy easy interpretation. The brownstone is gone. The people who entered it are gone. The records that might explain what truly happened were either never created or have been lost to time. What cannot be erased, however, is the fact that for a brief period in the winter and spring of 1932, a group of individuals gathered in a basement in Chicago and engaged in acts of self-inflicted harm under the guidance of a man who promised them salvation. They did so willingly, desperately, and in complete silence. The world above continued as though they did not exist. When they vanished, no one noticed. When the building was torn down, no one remembered why it had stood empty for so long. The stain on the basement floor was covered with concrete, the names on the wall were destroyed, and the story became one more forgotten fragment of a city's history. But forgetting does not erase. The details remain buried in archives and private letters, waiting for anyone willing to look closely enough. And for those who do look, the question lingers. What happens to belief when it is pushed beyond the limits of reason? What happens to people who are so broken by loss that they will open their own veins in search of a miracle? The answer, perhaps, is that they disappear, not in a single moment, but gradually, piece by piece, until nothing remains but a name carved into a wall and a story that no one wants to tell. The brownstone on South Throop Street is gone, but the silence it contained persists. It persists in the gaps of the historical record, in the missing persons reports that were never filed, in the families who stopped asking questions because there were no answers to be found. It persists in the knowledge that suffering, when left unaddressed, can metastasize into something far darker than the pain itself. It persists in the recognition that the line between faith and delusion is not always clear, and that those who cross it rarely find their way back. Emmett Crowder understood this. He understood that people in pain will reach for anything that promises relief, and that the more desperate they become, the less they question the cost. He offered them a narrative in which their suffering had meaning, in which their blood was not wasted, but sacred. He told them they were chosen. He told them they were close. He told them to wait just a little longer, and they did. They waited until their bodies gave out, until their minds fractured, until they vanished entirely, and when the waiting ended, there was no miracle. There was only absence. To this day, no one knows how many people entered the brownstone on South Throop Street during those 6 months in 1932. The names on the basement wall numbered 18, but there may have been others whose names were never recorded. There may have been others who left before the end and carried the scars in silence for the rest of their lives. There may have been others who, like Margaret Hollis, disappeared so completely that even their absence went unnoticed. The truth is that the full scope of what occurred will never be known. The evidence is too fragmentary, the witnesses are too few, and the passage of time has obscured too much. What can be said with certainty is that a group of people, bound by shared suffering and a desperate hope, placed their trust in a man who offered them something the world would not. They paid for that trust with their bodies, their minds, and in some cases their lives. Whether Emmett Crowder believed his own promises or was simply a manipulator who exploited the vulnerable is a question that cannot be answered. Both possibilities are equally plausible, and both are equally disturbing. In the end, the distinction may not matter. The result was the same.